In October 2008, a spacecraft roughly the size of a school bus plunged straight through a plume of erupting ice, traveling nearly 18 kilometers every second, close to 64,000 kilometers per hour. It skimmed just 21 kilometers above the surface of a small, frozen moon circling Saturn. At that speed and altitude, even a tiny miscalculation could have shredded the entire spacecraft on impact. Ground control had no way to step in. The flight path had already been programmed, and all anyone on Earth could do was wait roughly 80 minutes for a radio signal to travel more than 1 billion kilometers back home. The spacecraft was Cassini. The moon was Enceladus, and it had already been under Cassini's watch for 17 years. The data gathered in those few high-speed seconds sat largely untouched in mission archives for years, its real meaning buried under noise until scientists finally had the tools to pull it apart properly. When they did, it confirmed something extraordinary. The chemical building blocks of life are being assembled right now, in real time, inside an ocean that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. That discovery is only the latest turn in a story that's been building quietly for 2 decades, one that has now pushed an entire continent to commit its largest space budget in 50 years toward finding out what's really down there. Enceladus orbits Saturn at a distance of about 238,000 kilometers, itself roughly 4 billion kilometers from the Sun, close enough to Saturn that the planet's storm bands would dominate almost the entire sky overhead. The moon itself is small, barely 500 kilometers across. You could walk its diameter in roughly the time it takes to drive across a mid-sized country. Surface temperatures hover around minus 200 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze almost anything on contact. By every reasonable expectation, this should be a dead, frozen leftover from the solar system's formation, quietly circling Saturn for 4.5 billion years without doing anything remarkable. That's exactly what scientists assumed when Cassini reached Saturn in the summer of 2004 after a 7-year journey across the solar system. Enceladus was barely on the itinerary, a minor icy body to photograph on the way to more compelling targets. They were wrong, and being wrong about this one small moon has since redirected the space programs of 2 continents. The earliest flybys were routine photograph. The surface, take basic readings, move on. But something was streaming off this supposedly lifeless moon in volumes large enough to physically push against one of the strongest magnetic fields in the solar system. Mission planners rewrote the flight plan almost immediately, sending Cassini back for closer, faster passes, with every instrument trained on the southern hemisphere. What they found wasn't a dead world at all, it was erupting. Near the South Pole, Cassini's cameras revealed 4 massive parallel fractures cut deep into the ice, each stretching well over 100 kilometers and plunging hundreds of meters down. Material escaping from these fractures spreads along the moon's orbital path, forming a vast halo around Saturn known as the erring Enceladus. Isn't just orbiting quietly, it's actively seeding its own orbital path with frozen seawater. Sit with how strange that really is. A moon smaller than many countries are wide is spraying its own internal ocean into space fast enough to help build one of Saturn's rings. At least one of the rings people recognize from photographs is ancient leftover debris. It's being actively replenished by a small icy moon quietly venting its hidden ocean. That fact alone carries a huge implication. You can't spray liquid water into space unless liquid water actually exists to spray. Somewhere beneath that armored crust, something has never fully frozen. Careful measurements of gravity and density eventually mapped out what lies beneath. Under roughly 20 kilometers of ice, considerably thinner near the South Pole, Enceladus holds a global ocean of salty liquid water, about 10 kilometers deep, deeper than Earth's own Mariana Trench. Saturn's gravitational pull keeps Enceladus from settling into a neat circular orbit. Instead, its path is stretched into an ellipse, so the moon is perpetually falling toward Saturn and drifting back out again. Each close pass stretches the moon's body out of shape. Each retreat lets it relax. Squeeze, release, endlessly. Deep in the rocky core, all that flexing grinds. Rock against rock, and friction does what friction always does, generates heat. Scientists call this tidal heating, and it functions like a permanent internal furnace melting ice from below and keeping an entire ocean liquid in total darkness. This mechanism turns out to matter well beyond Enceladus. Once researchers confirmed that tidal heating alone could sustain a liquid ocean this far from the sun, it reshaped where scientists look for potentially habitable environments across the solar system. Distance from the sun stopped being the deciding factor. Any icy moon locked in the right gravitational relationship with a larger neighbor became a legitimate candidate, no matter how cold or dark its surroundings. Jupiter's moon Europa is thought to work through a broadly similar process. For years, the best evidence came from sampling Saturns. airing directly. Cassini's dust analyzer instrument caught ice grains as it flew through them, revealing organic compounds early on. Then, in 2018, something heavier turned up: large, complex carbon-based macromolecules. That's where the October 2008 flyby re-enters the story. It was the fastest, closest pass Cassini ever attempted, tearing directly through the geyser at 21 kilometers altitude and nearly 18 kilometers per second. The ice grains captured that day had left the ocean only minutes earlier, far too recently for meaningful radiation damage to have altered them. The extreme speed mattered for another reason too. At slower impact velocities, water molecules tend to clump together and mask the underlying chemical signal. Only at this exceptional velocity did that masking effect break down enough to reveal what was really there. A reanalysis of that data published in autumn 2025 identified chain-like hydrocarbons, cyclic esters, alkenes, ethers, and tentative signs of nitrogen and oxygen-bearing compounds, alongside the ring-shaped aromatic molecules already known from earlier work. None of these had ever been detected before in ice from an ocean beyond Earth. Esters and ethers act essentially as chemical connectors, the links that allow simple carbon-based molecules to combine into more complex ones. With this finding, any doubt evaporated. This chemistry was produced by radiation exposure in space. It was manufactured inside the moon itself just minutes before reaching the vacuum. To understand what could generate such molecules under 20 kilometers of solid ice, researchers turned from Saturn back to Earth's own seafloor kilometers beneath the Atlantic. In permanent darkness, the crust splits open in places where mineral-rich superheated fluid pours from towering rock chimneys and collides with near-freezing seawater. That reaction, called serpentinization, occurs when iron and magnesium, rock reacts with water, releasing heat, hydrogen gas, and complex carbon-based molecules precisely the kind Cassini detected in Enceladus plumes. Astrobiologists often assess a world's potential using the acronym CNOPS carbon. Hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, the 6 elements that make up essentially all known life. Cassini found the first 4 relatively quickly. Phosphorus, though, stayed elusive for years, and its absence mattered enormously. Phosphorus forms the structural backbone of DNA and sits at the center of ATP, the molecule every cell on Earth uses to move energy internally. Without it, interesting chemistry is possible, but not biology. For a long stretch, the missing phosphorus was treated as a genuine roadblock. Some researchers wondered whether it might simply be locked too tightly inside Enceladus' rocky core to ever reach the ocean, which would have effectively ended the conversation. The answer finally came in June 2023, 6 years after Cassini itself had been deliberately steered into Saturn's atmosphere and destroyed in 2017 to eliminate any risk of contaminating the moon. A research team revisited archived airing dust readings and found clear evidence of phosphorus after all, along with signs supporting multiple energy-generating chemical pathways operating simultaneously within the ocean. One especially notable compound was hydrogen cyanide, toxic to humans, but also central to the chemistry believed to precede life, since lab reactions involving it can generate both amino acids and the building blocks of nucleic acids. Researchers have described it as something like a multi-purpose tool for assembling life's earliest chemical precursors. Having multiple energy pathways matters more than it might seem. On Earth, simple microbial communities near hydrothermal vents survive by combining hydrogen with carbon dioxide through a process called methanogenesis, essentially running on the chemical equivalent of a small battery. Having the right ingredients on hand is the same as being able to actually cook with them. So in January 2026, research teams in Japan and Germany set out to recreate Enceladus ocean in the laboratory, reproducing its pressure temperature, mineral composition, and hydrothermal chemistry. They cycled samples between extreme heat near 150 degrees and freezing conditions down to minus 40 degrees. Mimicking the squeeze and release rhythm, Saturn's gravity imposes on the moon with every orbit. Then they let the system run. The results included a genuinely wide array of complex organic molecules, aldehydes, nitriles, carboxylic acids, amines, and even amino acids, such as glycine, alanine, and serine. Notably, the freezing process alone generated simple amino acids like glycine without any hydrothermal heating required. Many of the lab-produced compounds closely matched what Cassini had originally detected at Saturn. Take a moment with that a chemical recipe first read from another world was successfully reproduced here on Earth. And it works. Amino acids build proteins, proteins build cells. Enceladus isn't merely a place where life might someday become possible. It's a place where the chemistry that directly precedes life has already been shown to unfold entirely on its own with no outside intervention needed. None of this is some ancient frozen relic of the past. In November 2022, the James Webb Space Telescope observed the south pole of Enceladus directly and captured a single continuous jet of water vapor stretching more than 9,600 kilometers into space, over 20 times the length of the moon producing it. It is erupting at this very moment. Taken together, these findings carry far more weight than any one result alone. Liquid water on its own would be notable. Organic molecules alone would be notable. Phosphorus alone would be notable. It's the fact that every item on the habitability checklist keeps turning up one after another from the same small moon that has genuinely shifted how the scientific community treats this target. None of this proves organisms actually live there, and researchers are careful to say so. Finding the right ingredients removes an obstacle, but it doesn't confirm a conclusion. If this ocean is warm, salty, chemically rich, and actively producing organic molecules right now, why didn't Cassini simply detect organisms directly? The answer isn't really about astronomy, it's about engineering. Cassini was designed in the 1980s and launched in October 1997, years before anyone knew Enceladus had an ocean, let alone an active plume. It was built as a geology and atmospheric mission meant to study Saturn's broader system, weighing molecules, mapping magnetic fields, charting terrain. It carried no microscope, no instrument capable of sequencing genetic material or identifying something like a cell wall. Cassini didn't miss alien life sitting in plain view. It was simply never equipped with the ability to look for it. It was sent to search for smoke, and it found smoke pouring from every crack in the ice. It's a humbling position for an entire field of science. The case for Enceladus habitability didn't emerge from a single dramatic new mission built to chase it. It came from painstakingly re-examining old data, sometimes nearly 2 decades old, using instruments and methods that didn't exist when Cassini first launched. Every major breakthrough in this story has come from rereading, not rediscovering, squeezing new answers out of information that had been sitting quietly in the archives all along, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Here's the part few people know. Back in 2021, the European Space Agency's long-term science plan Voyage 2050 issued a formal call for missions, targeting the moons of the giant planets. In 2024, after years of expert review, an ESA committee named Enceladus the clear top target, head of both Titan and Europa for the agency's next flagship mission, designated L4. Feasibility studies through 2024 and 2025 confirmed the mission could be built using existing European rockets, a full orbiter paired with a dedicated lander, designed to touch down at the South Pole and operate on the surface for at least 2 weeks. Then, in late November 2025, ministers from all 23 ESA member states met in Bremen, Germany, and approved a budget of just over 22 billion euros for the agency's work over the next 3 years. The largest financial commitment in ESA's 50-year history, roughly 32 above the previous funding cycle. Tucked inside that record budget is the early development funding for the L4 mission to Enceladus' current plans, have it launching around 2042 aboard an Ariane 6 rocket arriving in the Saturn system in the early 2050s. It would tour several of Saturn's moons, sample the plume from orbit, and eventually set a lander down directly on the erupting terrain at the South Pole for weeks of surface operations complete with sterilization protocols and a protective bioshield to prevent Earth microbes from contaminating the sample. Committing this level of funding so far in advance is unusual even by the standards of planetary science, a field already known for thinking in decades rather than years. It reflects just how seriously this data has been taken behind the scenes, long before most of the public had ever heard of Enceladus outside a documentary. Developing an entirely new generation of instruments capable of directly detecting biological activity rather than merely inferring habitability from chemistry takes time, and that work has to start now to be ready for a narrow launch window roughly 16 years away. The proposed payload includes a dedicated mass spectrometer descent and surface cameras, geophysical sensors, a physical sampling system, and a purpose-built biomarker detection lab. Exactly the hardware Cassini never carried because no one yet knew it would be needed. The timing isn't flexible. The launch window depends on orbital mechanics and a precise sunlight angle needed at the South Pole upon arrival. Miss it, and the next real opportunity slips away by decades, which is exactly why the underlying technology needed funding now more than 15 years before anything leaves the ground. So here's where we are: a global ocean of liquid water, a permanent internal heat source, keeping it liquid, a rocky seafloor actively releasing hydrogen phosphates, aromatic compounds, esters, and ethers, a laboratory experiment on Earth that has now proven this exact recipe assembles itself unaided. Everything is in place, except one thing a machine built, specifically to go look. That machine now exists on paper, complete with a chosen landing site and an approved budget. It's worth remembering how quickly this whole picture came together. Cassini's first hint that something was strange came from an anomalous magnetic field reading back in 2005 a single unexpected data point. From there confirmed plumes, then a confirmed ocean, then organic molecules, then phosphorus, then a working laboratory recipe, and now a funded flagship mission with a landing site already chosen. That entire chain of discovery unfolded within roughly 2 decades remarkably fast by the standards of planetary science. If that pace continues, the years leading up to arrival in the 2050s could become some of the most closely watched in the entire history of the search for life beyond Earth. For the first time, we're no longer simply asking whether we could search for life on another world. We're genuinely counting down to actually doing it. And here's something worth remembering. As that countdown continues, every answer. This small moon has given us, so far, came from data we already had, sitting quietly in our own archives, sometimes for nearly 2 decades before anyone thought to look at it the right way. The next major discovery about Enceladus is probably already sitting in an archive somewhere, waiting for someone to notice.